I just want to tell a quick story about my parents, which I thought was cool. So the year is 1983. One of my dad's first jobs out of college was working as a tour guide because his English was reasonably good for someone who was living in China and grew up in China at the time. So he took these tourists from other countries, such as America, around to tourist destinations. And this is when one of the early waves of tourists were starting to come to China. So like this is when China was starting to open its doors to more tourism and stuff. It was a fairly new thing. And my dad just wanted, he wanted to talk to the folks who were visiting. And he remembered distinctly this middle-aged couple who said they were from America. They were very quiet, they were very unassuming. And he chatted with them because a lot of the other tourists were, in a group, they were more loud and everything. So this kind of quiet couple, let's just call them Alice and Bill for the sake of simplicity. So Alice and Bill, chatted with my dad, and then, they really appreciated him taking the effort to talk to them and tell them about all the touristy stuff and everything. And at the end of their trip, they offered to leave their contact information, their phone number in America. And they said, like, if you ever visit America, try to call us and and such. So my dad wrote down their phone number, but he had like no idea how he was ever going to use it, because back then the thought of someone who grew up in China ever coming to America, just even to visit, was just unfathomable, because it was just like, it was like you're going to the moon or something, because like it just cost so much money to take a plane, and like no one had money at the time. So it was just like unfathomable to think that, for my dad to think that he would ever go to America. And, at this same time, my mother was thinking about opportunities to go to America to pursue graduate training, most notably a master's program. And, my dad kept this Alice and Bill's number in mind. And lo and behold, a year later, I think, my mother got the chance to go to SUNY Albany, the State University of New York in Albany, in upstate New York, to do a master's program in sociology on a scholarship, because they had come to China to recruit students from their college. And so she came to the U.S., she had this canonical story, with just one suitcase and like $40 or something. And it was, a harrowing journey of flying into New York City, first time on a plane, and then through New York City, you had to go like take the bus up to Albany. It's probably 6 hours. Anyhow, my dad gave her the number for Alice and Bill. And they had no idea where these people lived in America. They just knew, okay, America. It was clearly a big place. They had no context about them at all. So my mother went to, start graduate school. And that later turned, from a master's into a PhD. So she stayed. She was originally only intending to stay for 2 years, because her entire family, my father, myself, I was just a baby back then. Our extended family, all of our family was in China then. She was the only one who had ever gone abroad and ever gone to do graduate training somewhere. So, she was just planning to get a degree in the US really fast, 2 years on the scholarship, and go back home. But that ended up turning into a 5-year PhD. Anyway, so the first, month or two, or whenever she was there, she decided to just call this number, because she, she was like, whatever, let's just see what happens. She had never met this couple before, because only my dad knew them from this tourist guide, from this trip. So she just called them, and she said that, my father had gotten their number. He was their tourist guide, and that she was here in the U.S. studying in upstate New York. And I think they got to talking, or like they sent some letters back and forth or something. And then the first Thanksgiving, so Thanksgiving in the US is in like late November. And my mother had no idea what Thanksgiving was, right? She had no idea about the US holiday. So the first Thanksgiving, I think they called her, or they mailed her something, and they said, why don't you come fly down to Georgia? They lived in a small town in Georgia, outside of Atlanta. Why don't you fly down here and spend Thanksgiving with our family, because you don't have family in the US. You're all alone here in this country. and my mother could not afford to fly back to China because it was super far and expensive. She couldn't afford to go visit. So she would just be spending the holidays by herself, or with other international graduate students who were in the U.S. and upstate New York, which is extremely snowy and very very desolate in the winter. Right, it's like really really snowy and gloomy in the winter. And the couple said, "Why don't you come down to Georgia?" And my mother was like, "I have no money," right? Like she had no money at all. She's like, "How am I gonna possibly come down?" Take a flight or whatever. And they said, "Don't worry, we'll get you a ticket." So it turned out that this couple was very unassuming couple, was actually reasonably wealthy. They were entrepreneurs in Georgia at the time. And I think it makes sense in retrospect, because back then, to be able to go to China on a tour group was a pretty big deal. Like, just regular people just wouldn't be able to afford that. So it kind of makes sense in retrospect that they probably had a bit of money. And they just bought my mother a plane ticket from New York, a round trip ticket from New York to Georgia. And it was shockingly expensive. My mother said it was like over $1,000 or something. And it was 1983 or 1984 dollars, right? So it was probably $2,000 or something in today's dollars. It was shockingly expensive. And it's funny because her first thought, she relayed to when she was telling me, so her first thought was, can I just keep the money? Because back then $1,000 or $1,500 was an enormous amount of money. But yeah, I mean, she obviously didn't say that. So she accepted their ticket, and she had no idea how to like get to the airport or like navigate everything. And she eventually figured it out, and she went down to their house for Thanksgiving, and it was just this such a welcoming experience, just total strangers, just welcoming my mother in to their house, for the holidays. And she was a young graduate student at the time, alone in the country, all by herself, half a world away, probably like 8,000 miles away, half a world away from her child, her husband, her extended family, all her social support at all. And she was just by herself in the country. And this couple reached out to her that had no idea who she was, right? Besides just talking to my dad, just this tour group a year back. Anyways, so, and then they continued to invite her for Thanksgiving or for the holidays every year. And I think they paid for her ticket for the next, 3 or 4 years or so. And it's just an incredible gesture. They totally obviously didn't have to do that, right? They had no idea who my parents really were. And to cap off the story, the really lovely part of the story that I especially loved was, she kept in touch with Alice, who was the woman, and during her as she was approaching graduation, finishing her PhD, 5 years in this PhD program where she didn't get to see her family at all. During graduation, you would have your family, your parents come, your siblings, maybe your extended family. It's a big event, right? Like graduating from both college and from graduate school. It's a very big milestone. You have a robe, you dress up. It's ceremonial, but it's a big deal. But there was no way she was gonna be able to afford to have her family come to the U.S., like to get a visa, to fly people. That was just unfathomable, right? Given that we didn't really have any money back in China back then. Just unfathomable. So I mean, she was just gonna be like, whatever, I'll just graduate, get my degree. No one's gonna be in the audience for me, but whatever, it's fine. Like, I'm used to being by myself for those 5 years, and so Alice, who was a woman, she said, I'll fly up and I will be your family in the audience during your moment. And my mother was so touched by that. I mean, I kind of am, it kind of gets to me thinking about that, right? Someone who is, had no relation to us, and she recognized the importance of that milestone, that event, and she like flew up, and she, hung out with my mom for those few days, and she was in the audience and cheering her on when she was graduating, when like the rest of her family were like 8,000 miles away, like half the globe away. and then she, met my mother's PhD supervisors and such. And I just thought that was such a great story, and that was such a, you know, without getting too sentimental, that was like my parents' introduction to America, right? About, and they had they were so fortunate to have such a fortunate introduction to kind of how generous people were in this country to, they were immigrants from halfway around the world. And like back then, in the 80s, right, kind of communist China was seen as this kind of enemy of the United States politically, and it was this like really mysterious sort of authoritarian kind of place. And they just felt so welcome. And then my dad later came to visit, I think, and then they visited Alice and Bob's family in rural Georgia, and we kept in touch with them. And then when I moved to the U.S., we went to visit them because we lived in Louisiana for a few years. We drove and we visited them and spent time with their family and their extended family and such. And my parents were just so grateful for that initial experience, and they kept in touch for the past 30 or so years. I think they said that Bill, the man, he recently passed away, and the woman is they are fairly advanced in age. But that was just I thought that was such a beautiful story. So I'm gonna end it there.